we're going to have to end this. Thank you for your tolerance.
You're listening to the Psychedelic Salon, where people are changing their lives one thought at a time.
Did you catch that part just now where Terence said, one way to be intelligent is to be deconditioned to the propaganda we are all fed every day? As he said, you cannot live half slave and half free. Well, I've been thinking about that for a long time now. In fact, I've just spent the last 6.5 years struggling to organize my thinking about that idea, and the result is my novel, The Genesis Generation, which I finally finished writing 2 days ago. As I said at the beginning of this podcast, today holds special significance for me, and for 2 reasons. The first one is that as soon as I get this podcast posted online, I'll begin recording the last chapter of that book for release next week as an audiobook. And so next week's podcast will consist of me reading the first chapter of The Genesis Generation. And I'm telling you that as a warning to our fellow saloners who are less than impressed with my personal chatter on these podcasts. In fact, I've got to read part of a blog posting that a saloner sent me, and which put a huge smile on my face. I don't know the name of the blog, but the poster was someone who calls himself or herself Laser Cave, or maybe it's PDXFF, whatever that means. Anyway, here's the part of that posting that I really liked. It goes, "Oh, and for those of you who frequent the Psychedelic Salon podcast, the 6 casts on chaos, creativity, and imagination from last December are an extremely rewarding listen. Maybe this is old news, but remember when listening to these to keep your ear tuned closely. When Lorenzo is saying his usual ridiculous commentary, he totally gives props to Tim Donovan on one of the tracks. It's quite amusing." Well, besides the part about my usual ridiculous commentary, which is what you happen to be listening to right now, I might add, I wondered about the part about Tim Donovan, because not only do I not have any memory of saying that, I can't even recall who Tim Donovan is, which for me reinforces the idea that, I guess my commentary must really be ridiculous. But since I belong to the Brendan Behan School of Public Relations that states one shouldn't worry about what anybody says about you as long as they spell your name right, so thanks for the publicity. We'll take it any way we can get it. But next week's program will be all me, and so don't say you weren't warned. And I guess I shouldn't just leave you hanging about the theme of my novel. Basically, it's about awakening, transformation, and Terence's dream of an archaic psychedelic society. And it's basically the story about the transformation of a 29-year-old yuppie geek into an underground hero in the psychedelic community. As I said, I'll be posting the first chapter in next week's podcast, and assuming that I can finish recording and building the delivery infrastructure by then, it will be available for purchase for the princely sum of $12, which will run you about $1 an hour, as it takes about 12 hours to hear the entire book. But that's for next week. Today I want to mention one more personal item, though, because this date, June 3rd, is a particularly significant one for me because of where I was and what I was doing 40 years ago today. I would ask you to think about what you were doing 40 years ago today, but from what I know about our fellow saloners, most of you weren't even a twinkle in your parents' eye back then. In my case, however, I was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, serving as the navigator for a U.S. Navy task force that arrived at the site where the submarine Scorpion went down a year earlier. We were to spend the next couple of months floating over that spot while the bathyscaphe Trieste made 9 dives of more than 11,000 feet down to investigate the cause of her loss and the loss of the 99 brave men who went down with her. And so I wanted to remember those men and their families today. Well, that's enough of the heavy stuff for a while. As I mentioned earlier, we may be coming to the end of the line on new talks by Terence McKenna. And while I still have a significant amount of material from the Timothy Leary archive, as well as some interviews I want to do, Still, I've been thinking that maybe we ought to make a few changes in these podcasts. Nothing radical, but maybe spice it up a bit. And so I'm thinking about adding a Skype record button to our Notes from the Psychedelic Salon website for you to leave audio comments, some of which maybe I could integrate into the podcasts. I'm still not clear on how to implement this because it most likely will involve finding some volunteers to listen to the comments and help the most relevant ones bubble to the top and find their way into a podcast. And I've got some other ideas about the salon and associated websites becoming more of a social gathering place where we can find and talk with the others without any commercial interference by banner ads and stuff like that. Again, since I have no clear ideas on how to make this a reality, my guess is that you and some of our other fellow saloners will help us evolve our little community even a little further along. Now, one of the things that has prompted me to think in this direction is due to all of the great music that our fellow saloners have been sending. Hopefully, one day we'll have a podcast from the salon that consists only of music. As you know, I occasionally play a song at the end of a program, and in podcast number 120, I included several songs that were sent to me. And just this past week, I received a link from some music from Shah, who is a music producer and fellow saloner who joins us each week from his home in Israel. In it, he has used a few samples from the salon, and for what it's worth, I really enjoy listening to all of the interesting things that Shah and some of the others have done with samples from the salon. Hopefully, I'll remember to add a link to his music along with the program notes for this podcast, which, as you know, you can find at psychedelicsalon.org. And over the past few months, I've received dozens of pieces of music created by our fellow saloners, including a great CD from Clint Avery that took me back to some of my first encounters with our sacred medicines. And that was quite an interesting experience, I'm here to tell you. Also, Greg S. sent me an experimental meditation video that I plan to test drive on my next journey into entheospace. So, all in all, I am overloaded with wonderful new sights and sounds. And I wish I had time to mention everyone who has sent me something along these lines, but I do want to mention one more group whose music I've grown very fond of, and that is the group Tibet to Timbuktu. I first heard them on Queer Ninja's bi-weekly podcast over at the Cannabis Podcast Network at dopefiend.co.uk. In fact, the second time I heard them was on the Dope Fiends podcast itself, and then again on BB's Bungalow. And BB, or Black Beauty, by the way, is also the person whose silky voice you just heard in the break between the lecture and this commentary. And if you haven't spent any time in BB's Bungalow yet, well, you simply don't know what you're missing. Anyway, if, like me, you are already a regular listener to the programs on the Dope Fiends Network, you've already heard several cuts from the Tibet to Timbuktu CD. But that isn't going to keep me from playing one, too, and I'll do that at the end of today's podcast, thanks to their permission for letting me do so. Now, let's see. There are a couple more things I want to pass along, and then I'll be out of here for today. Oh yeah, Burning Man. First of all, here is a little story that doesn't actually have a reason for me to tell it here, other than the fact that I think it points out why things like Burning Man, the salon, and other ways that we are going about finding each other that are popping up all over the place. Here is what fellow saloner Barbara S. wrote. Hi, Lorenzo. I just got back from one of the East Coast regional burns, Playa del Fuego, and was thinking of you. I met some of the others. There was a small camp of wonderful people that played some of your podcasts over the weekend. I stopped by to chat for a while with them, and now I have some new friends, and a little piece of them came home with me from the playa in the form of 6 baby heirloom tomato plants that they gifted me when I mentioned making some homemade sauce. Thank you for helping to bring more of us together. Well, thanks for the kind words, Barbara, but it wasn't me who brought you together. It was those wonderful people who were playing the podcast in the first place. Not to mention all of the people who were involved in putting on the Afterburn event. So thanks to all of you. But your story does remind me that I should let you know that our Burning Man plans are in a state of flux right now. Unless there is another change, I'm afraid that the Angel Oasis where I was going to camp isn't going to appear after all this year.